While Mag is not my first or most used Warframe, she is by far my favourite, as you can probably tell by the name of this channel. My journey with Mag was initially jumping on the bandwagon of Mag bad before gaining critical thinking skills and asking, why Mag bad? So I picked her up, toyed around with her kit, and... oh. Mag is one of the oldest on the roster, being released way back in the beta in 2012, and okay, yeah, back then she was bad. Her damage was awful outside of Corpus missions, and this was back in the days of Draco Series when that was the meta for farming. Over the years she has gotten several changes, reworks, overhauls, and buffs. I still occasionally see people dunk on Mag for being bad compared to the other starter frames, but from mid to end game, she outclasses both of them handily, and is able to more than hold her own against the majority of the roster in almost every aspect of content, save for like, Lure Spy, I guess. Mag's concept is that of magnetism. Shocking, I know. In gameplay she is a crowd control centered Warframe, which in the current meta people shit on heavily, but she is far more than a one-trick pony, and thanks to the power of... she can do this. Yeah, okay, we'll get to that. I think the reason why Mag gets so much hate is because she is more complex than the other starter frames Volt and Excalibur. Her powers require synergy and an in-depth understanding of her mechanics to master. Whereas the other two, you hit the button, do the thing. Flash dash stabs people, speed gives you speed, radial blind is, well, a radial blind, and so on. Mag is a thinking man's Warframe, and by that, I mean you press more than one button. I've already yapped enough, so let's look at her kit and how best to build and utilise her. Starting off with her passive then, she doesn't have one. Okay, alright, I'll talk about it. Mag's passive automatically vacuums pickups towards her, such as resources, loot, ammo, energy, and health orbs, within an 8 meter radius around her. It functions identically to the mod's vacuum and fetch, but with a lower radius. Now, you might be saying to yourself, an extra 8 meter loot pickup range sounds really helpful. It'll let you pick up orbs from further away to keep your energy up, grab loot easier, and you don't have to risk your neck grabbing life support in survival missions. But that's where you're wrong. See, this effect gets completely overwritten by those aforementioned mods. It doesn't add to the range, the game just picks whichever has the higher range and uses that. This means that if you really wanted to, you can drop these mods on your companions in exchange for better utility or damage. But the issue here is that Mag's passive has a lower radius. Now, this is a big deal because, while sure, a 5.5 meter difference doesn't sound too bad, this is a radius. We bust out the old equation A equals pi r squared, where A is the area and r is the radius of our circle. We can show that this 5.5 meter difference equates to a total of 371 meter loss of the coverage. This means that Mag's passive is less than half as effective as these mods. Plus, if you do choose to alter your companion loadouts for Mag to remove fetch and vacuum for other mods, unless you exclusively play Mag, you'd need to swap companion builds every time you wanted to swap to or from Mag, which for me is more hassle than it's worth. Regardless, if you somehow either don't have these mods or are running a super endless endurance mission and you really need that extra companion mod slot, you can make use of her passive, but in 99% of cases, it's not worth it. I wish she had a different passive that synergized more with her kit. Something along the lines of whenever a condition is met, such as killing an enemy affected by any of her powers would grant you a Polarize shard. This would give a better Magnetized synergy, or grant some sort of passive buff for each Polarize shard she has active, similar to Nova's Nullstar. Would this be insanely strong? Probably, but I'm not on the balance team, and either way I've gotten way ahead of myself, so let's move on to her first ability, Pull. Mag creates a vortex in front of her which drags all enemies towards its centre, both within a fixed 6 meter radius around the vortex and a 25 meter cone in front of the vortex, moddable by range. Enemies affected by Pull are afflicted with the Ragdoll status effect for its duration and take a token 300 magnetic damage moddable by strength. Enemies immune to crowd control effects such as overguarded enemies, acolytes, and bosses, to name a few, only take this magnetic damage and are not ragdolled or pulled towards the vortex in any way. In addition, using Pull on Polarize shards will pull them towards Mag and cause them to orbit around her, but we'll come on to that when we talk about Polarize a bit later. Pull is a very useful tool, since not only can it group mobs up for good damage, be that from her powers, her weapons, or Magnetized bubble, or whatever the fuck the Arca Titron's been on the last few patches, it also provides some utility in the aforementioned Polarize shards gathering, but also in the form of other niche things such as pulling enemies away from interception terminals and gathering loot through its augment, really Pull, which will yank all the pickups dropped within its range towards Mag. This augment sees some niche uses in borderline AFK setups involving hallway camping and end survival missions, and when it's subsumed onto other frames like Necros for endo farming and Sedna arenas. So unless you're running either of those two, I would advise to stay away from this augment. Mag's builds are already very cramped, and this mod doesn't really provide much for its slot. In short, use pull to group up a bunch of enemies for big damage, pull them into the radius of Magnetized bubble, collect Polarized shards from a distance, and if you can't be asked, use greedy pull to get the loot for you. Moving on to her best power, Magnetize. Magnetize has two different variants, tap cast and a hold cast. In truth, the tap cast is the one that's only really worth using, so we'll discuss that first. Mag creates a bubble on an enemy with an unlimited range provided she has line of sight. Now, this line of sight is generous. So much as 1/5 of a bombard's right pinky toe is enough to count as line of sight, meaning that a lot of the times you can hit enemies from behind walls. The target is anchored to the spot and emits a magnetic field with a 4-meter radius modeled by range, and drags enemies within an 8-meter radius towards its center, also modeled by range. During the field's lifespan, bullets, projectiles, and polarized shards within range will be sucked towards its center. The enemy targeted by the Magnetize will suffer a 2x damage multiplier modeled by strength. So targeting an Acolyte will double all the damage they take, and this is a really good way to utilize the power. Targeting enemies like Acolytes or overguarded enemies immune to CC will still have the bubble placed on them, but they won't suffer the rooting effect and will instead drag the Magnetized field around with them. This can lead to very silly situations where this bubbled Exergis will run around and collect enemies into one large cluster for you, and a nice little pile for you to nuke. It's really, really fun. Okay, so it's a CC power that can act as a bullet attractor. What's the big deal? 25% of all incoming damage dealt to enemies within the bubble from bullets, projectiles, and polarized shards is stored in the bubble, and dealt back as ticks of magnetic damage every half second. Now, this damage doesn't take into consideration crit, but does take into consideration multi-shot as well as... You can also make the most of the grouping effect to really pump up the damage of gas and electric procs, which let you pull stuff like this, which is pretty damn silly. Another thing you can do is that normally enemies' bullets can't hurt each other, right? But if we apply radiation to the mix, enemies will start to shoot out into the magnetized bubble and be magnetized right back to themselves. This can cause some very fun feedback loop type setups where enemies will kill each other and stack up the tick damage. When the duration of Magnetize ends, or is cancelled using its augment, and the initial target of the Magnetize dies, then the field will destabilize and explode, dealing 300 blast damage modeled by strength in a 15-meter radius modeled by range. Now, again, you might be saying that 300 blast damage isn't that much. Enemies at high level have hundreds of thousands of EHP, so 300 blast damage is hardly a nuke, even with a high strength stat, but oh, dear viewer, my sweet summer child, you didn't let me finish. Each time an enemy takes that half-second tick of magnetic damage from the bubble, that damage is stored and added to the final explosion of the bubble. So if we deal 1000 damage to an enemy, and they remain within the bubble for its full base duration of 15 seconds, they would take 30 ticks of 1000 damage divided by 4, so 30 ticks of 250 magnetic damage. We take that magnetic damage and multiply that out by the number of ticks, we get a total of 7500 damage, which we then add to our base 300 for our final damage explosion of 7800. Which, sure, isn't that much, but let's use some more realistic numbers like, yeah, that'll do. Plugging this new value into our formula gives us a total of 817,800 blast damage. But that's just one damage number hitting one enemy. If we use AoE weapons, then this number goes even higher, to the point where nothing in the explosion's range is left standing. However, if the target of the Magnetize is alive when it is cancelled, or the duration runs out, the field does not destabilize and instead harmlessly collapses. Now, you can have up to 3 magnetized bubbles active at any given time, and casting a 4th will cause the oldest bubble to instantly collapse, triggering its explosion provided the original target is dead, or otherwise it will just disappear. This can cause a sort of chain reaction, wherein the explosion damage of one bubble collapsing can hit and amp up the damage of a separate bubble, resulting in higher and higher damage explosions. This is finicky to get consistently, but really damn rewarding when you're able to get it off. There is no greater joy than leveling a room with Grenier with your funny bubbles. Magnetize has some ability synergies with the rest of her kit, such as the aforementioned Polarize shards. As to how you get them, we'll talk about that a bit later as part of her kit, but for now, Just know that at base they deal 50 damage modeled by strength, with an even weighting of puncture and slash with a guaranteed status effect. This damage will also increase by 25% of the total value drained from Polarize. Again, don't worry about this, we'll talk about it later. Just know that you can fairly consistently get Polarize shards dealing 1000 to 2000 damage. Now, despite having such a low damage compared to other weapons, these things can absolutely shred even higher level enemies thanks to having... Eventually this does start to fall off, but we can remedy this. These shards are counted as weapon damage. So any form of weapon damage buff can increase their output. This includes the obvious like Rhino's Roar, Mirage's Eclipse, but also the odd ones like Citrine's Prismatic Gem. But the real interesting option is to use Nourish. These shards have 100% status chance, normally that means either puncture or slash, but with Nourish in the mix, we see viral procs, and a lot of them thanks to... This is also a good point to mention that since Viral's 325% damage multiplier acts within the damage formula, it will also increase the tick damage and explosion damage even more. This can let Magnetize hit some truly silly numbers, as well as give you all the buffs associated with Nourish like the extra energy generation. Another fun synergy is with Wisp's Breach Surge, as each Surge Spark counts towards its own instance of damage and therefore can increase the tick damage. This can cause a positive feedback loop where an enemy affected by the Breach Surge will take 100 damage from a magnetic tick, releasing a spark dealing 200 damage, increasing the tick damage to 150, which releases a spark dealing 300 damage, which increases the tick damage to 225, which increases the surge spark damage to 450. You get the idea. All that is to say, you can do this. Did I mention that both of these are helmet powers that you can subsume onto her? One final minor synergy with Magnetize is with her fourth ability Crush, which causes the enemies within to take extra damage on top of Magnetize's base damage vulnerability. This seems to be around 325-341% change, which sounds like a lot, but in all my time playing Mag, I have literally never noticed this until testing for this video because of how awful Crush's damage is at base. Now, I've seen Magnetize seem incredibly strong, and it is, but there are some things you need to be aware of. The final explosion is subject to fall-off and line of sight checks, so you won't be seeing any pre-nerf Prey of Dinar levels of carnage, but you can maximize this by stacking range as high as it can go. Also, getting the full power of all the tick damage is pretty rare, since if the enemy you targeted with Magnetize dies and its corpse despawns, the pulling effect ends, meaning you can't continuously pull mobs into the bubbles for the whole duration. Especially if you're killing with heat damage or have a Necros in your squad, both of these cause the bodies to despawn faster. As such, for builds which focus entirely on Magnetize, you can often get away with running around 60 to 80% power duration, since, save for a few augment mods, none of her powers aside from Magnetize care for duration, and instead all favour a high range. Also, projectiles and bullets redirected by the bubble travel in a straight line from the point at which they hit the bubble to its centre. This can make headshots kind of inconsistent, but if you aim for the top of the bubble, it can cause bullets to rain down on the enemy's heads, allowing you to give some more control over where you hit targets. Hitscan weapons have an easier time with this, I've found, but it's by no means consistent, so for the sake of using her, I would highly recommend Merciless or Dexterity for your damage arcane, as Deadheaded is too inconsistent to proc most of the time, but if you're able to hit headshots, the headshot multiplier is considered in the calculation for that magnetic tick damage and therefore its final explosion. The only other thing to be aware of when playing Mag and using Magnetize, especially in a squad, is teamwork. High range means bigger bubbles and also bigger explosion, but it can sabotage your team. For example, if you have a Cyto 9 in your squad, they're not going to appreciate the bubbles making headshots borderline impossible to hit, which can cause them to run out of invincibility and eventually die. However, there are synergies with other Warframes. Exalted Blade, Artemis Bow, Radial Javelin, and Prism's lasers all get redirected to the centre of the bubble, which can result in a lot of damage for these powers. The frame who gets the worst of this by far is Vauban. All his grenades get sucked in, which is fine for his mine layer since they activate if they hit an enemy, but in the case of Photon Strike, it needs to make contact with the ground. This results in the Photon Strike grenade being suspended until its internal timer runs out, at which point it will then detonate. It can also suck in the projectiles of melee attacks such as Glaives and Gunblades, so if a teammate's running one of them, they may not appreciate the constant redirection. Anyway, I hope I've been able to demonstrate just how good of an ability Magnetize is, but I get the feeling I've forgotten to mention something. I can't remember what it is. Oh shit, right. Okay, so what does this mean exactly? Well, if we take a weapon such as the Soma Prime, no mods, no multi-shot, nothing, and we shoot this heavy gunner once, she takes 1 tick of damage, right? Now if we put 2 enemies behind one another and mod for some punch through, and shoot again, we'll see that 2 damage numbers pop up, because we're hitting both enemies with 1 bullet, aka a multi-hit. This lets weapons work a hell of a lot in Magnetized bubbles, since each bullet is forced to orbit around the center of the Magnetized bubble, meaning it can hit multiple enemies really consistently instead of just the one. Other forms of this multi-hit include multi-shot, AoE attacks, AoE damage over time effects, which all cause an enemy to be hit multiple times by a single attack. However, there are 3 notable outliers in this, which are the Tenet Arca Plasmor, the Polarize shards, and the X47 amp. Let's talk about Polarize shards first, as they're the easiest to explain. So, when an enemy is hit by a Polarize shard orbiting around Mag, there is a tiny cooldown between then and the next time they can take damage from that Polarize shard. Now, this is normally balanced around the fact that these shards orbit around Mag, and it's almost impossible to hit an enemy with the same shard twice before it orbits back around her. Man, if only we had some way sort of, I don't know, group these enemies and shards on top of each other. During the field's lifespan, bullets, projectiles, and polarized shards within range, we suck towards its center. So yeah, it turns out that even if the damage is low, if that damage is fast, it can kill very effectively. As for the Tenet Arca Plasmor, which has infinite body punch through, this means that the projectile is only deleted when it reaches max range. This can be extended by modding for more projectile speed. When the Arca hits an enemy, it takes damage, and is flagged as taking a hit from that projectile. Its projectile then ricochets off the enemy, and if that projectile then goes to hit either another enemy or ricochets off geometry, something weird happens. The flag for that enemy's hit registration is removed. Why does this happen? I don't know. But what this means is that the Arca's projectile can hit the same enemy twice, provided it hits another enemy or map geometry first. If only there was some way to, I don't know, make the projectile be redirected into the same group of enemies over and over.
Oh, hello, Magnetize. What are you doing here?
Now, the Arca isn't the only weapon capable of such mass destruction. We'll come to that a bit later when it comes to weapon synergies, and oh boy do I have a lot. Finally, the X47 amp. For some reason, the alt fire, the glaive it fires out, has no hit cooldown, meaning that it can shred things in mag bubbles so fast. Finally, Magnetize has one augment called Magnetized Discharge, which allows Mag to manually detonate the bubble she is looking at by recasting the power at the cost of no energy. When any of her bubbles explode with this mod equipped, be that manual detonation or otherwise, all enemies caught in the blast radius have a 50% chance to be disarmed moddable by power strength. This augment also gives Magnetize an extra 45% range. This augment is frustrating. Don't get me wrong, the extra 45% range is always appreciated on a power with such high potential, but I'm of the opinion that the manual detonation should be part of the base kit and not require a mod slot. While yes, you can technically do manual detonation without it by just casting a 4th Magnetized bubble and letting the first one detonate, it's super finicky. As for the main draw of the augment being the disarm chance, I honestly don't like this that much. Between the Murmur, Infested, and Tekrot, there are a lot of melee enemy units that the disarm chance becomes less and less useful. And even on enemies who can be disarmed, it kinda goes against Magnetize's whole modus operandi of causing enemies to kill each other with radiation from their own reflective gunfire. While yes, this is a minor gripe, it also changed the enemies to melee AI, which is much more aggressive and doesn't use cover and just kind of dead sprints towards you, which can make it nice for funneling and killing enemies a bit quicker. Still, I use it. The manual detonation and more range is too good to pass up, but my pitch is this. Make the disarm chance 100%. Keep the range increased, but keep the manual detonation as part of her base kit. That way people can get a buffed version of the current mod, and everyone else gets the manual detonation perk, and I think it's a win-win for everyone involved. Now, I've talked about Magnetize for way too long, so let's look at her third ability, Polarize. Oh wait, shit, the hold version, damn it. Yeah, okay. Mag makes a singularity between her hands that contains 300 blast damage multiplied by strength, which increases by 25 damage per second. All bullets that pass within a 4-meter radius of Mag are absorbed into the singularity, and the damage they would have dealt is doubled and added to the blast damage. Also, any polarized shards within this radius, including the ones orbiting Mag, get added to the singularity, adding 500 damage multiplied by strength. When the duration ends or you recast her too, it unleashes this damage in a 120-degree cone up to 15 meters multiplied by range. This also receives the benefit from the augment, able to make a cone of disarming, which is pretty nice, but not the most useful. This version is bad. This version is real bad. Since you're forced into a slowed state, you can't use any movement tech, you can't attack with ranged or melee, all you can do is a single jump and aim glide, no sliding, no rolling, no nothing. And while sure, in this state you are immune to all gunfire and ranged attacks, that does nothing for melee, which if you're running the augment, guess what? You turn all of the ranged units into melee units anyway. And the icing on this nightmare cake is that it absorbs your Polarize shards for an extra 500 blast damage, so they can't even be used to fund the better version of this power. In short, stay away from the hold cast, stick to using the tap cast. It's fun and niche and gimmicky to just have a cone of disarming, but if you wanted a disarming effect, you're better off using the tap cast version as power, since it's a radial disarm instead of a frontal cone. Now, actually, on to Polarize. Mag releases an energy pulse in an 8 meter radius around her, modeled by range, which expands for 5 seconds, modeled by duration, at a constant rate of 5.9 meters per second. If the pulse hits an enemy, it will drain 400 shields and or permanently remove 400 armor, modelable by strength, and will deal true damage equal to the amount of armor removed. Now, if an enemy has both shields and armor at the same time, you'll need to fully deplete the shield before you can start removing the armor. Any allies within the pulse's original radius, including mag, or that come into contact with the pulse, will have 400 shields restored, modelable by strength. At base, you need 139% power strength to fully replenish your own shields. This benchmark is consistent between both base mag and her prime variant, as both have the same max shields of 555. This pulse isn't just limited to mag and her teammates, it can heal objectives, excavators, operatives, Nyx's mind control targets, Necros' Shadows of the Dead, and many more. The healing on these secondary targets is nice to have, but nowhere near as good as the full shield gate you can provide yourself and allies. The other thing about this power's shield restoration is that it cannot grant overshields, unfortunately, but that doesn't matter that much anyway for reasons you'll come to see soon. Each enemy who has their shields or armor drained by Polarize will unleash a burst of magnetic damage in a 4 meter radius modeled by range, dealing 250% of the amount drained as magnetic damage, modeled by strength. Enemies aren't damaged by their own explosions, but if you use Magnetize to cluster groups of mobs together, you can make situations where you can get 20 to 30 of these magnetic damage pops all from one cast of Polarize. Finally, each enemy drained in this way drops a Polarize shard, with an additional 50% chance to drop another. These shards linger in the air around where the enemy was drained for 30 seconds and can be picked up by mag by either walking within 3 meters of them or casting Pull, after which they begin to rapidly orbit around mag similar to Nova's Null Star. Enemies who come in contact with the shards will take damage, which, as we mentioned earlier, is 50, modelable by strength, plus 25 of the total value drained, with an even weighting of slash and puncture guaranteed status procs. This power has a lot going for it, but at the end of the day, the only thing we really care about is the Polarize shards. While the shield and armor drain is nice and all, and the team shield recovery is a positive, we will come onto why these aren't the most important aspects of the power a little bit later. Polarize has an augment called Counter Pulse. Enemies affected by Polarize will have their weapons jammed, and robotic enemies will be disabled for 4 seconds, modeled by duration. This effect is nice. Giving Mag another way to crowd control and give her a breather is great, don't get me wrong, but this does nothing for melee units, save for the rare robotic melee units like the mowers on the Valves that drop kick you from a mile away. The main issue I have with this mod isn't actually Counterpulse's fault at all. It's Magnetized Discharge. Earlier I mentioned how Magnetized Discharge is too good to pass up on most builds thanks to the extra range and the manual detonation, but due to its disarming effect, enemies that would otherwise be stunned by Counterpulse aren't, because Magnetized Discharge has disarmed them already. This means to get the most out of Counterpulse, you'd want to drop Discharge, which again, due to how good it is, means that isn't going to happen a lot of the time. And the few occasions where you do decide that Counterpulse is worth the slot, you're really going to miss that extra range and manual detonation of Magnetized Discharge. You could choose to run both, after all Discharge only has a chance to disarm, so you can sacrifice some consistency on Counterpulse, but still gain the extra range and manual detonation of Magnetized Discharge. Which, at that point, I'd question why. Is a 4-second stun really worth the mod slot that could go to increasing your range, your damage, survivability, hell, even mobility? Personally, I don't run Counterpulse all that option. I find that the very few use cases are just that, very few. Her kit is already crammed with CC, which often pulls double duties, either grouping in the case of pull and magnetize, or shield gating and armor strip in the case of crush, but we'll get to that. I would honestly like to see a whole rework of this augment, as in its current state I don't see any use in it. Maybe something more focused on the Polarize shards, something like granting damage reduction the more shards she has, or letting them fly off to nearby enemies and proc void status as if they're mini mag bubbles, or something simple as plus 100% duration on Magnetize, and when it reaches half its lifespan it starts to shrink back in on itself and brings the Polarize shards to its center so it's easier to collect them. Mag's final ability, which is what really brings her kit together, is Crush. Mag suspends enemies in an 18-meter radius moddable by strength by magnetizing their bones. Somehow. Don't ask me how that works, I'm a biologist, not a physicist. She then crushes them, as the name suggests, causing them to take 1,500 magnetic damage moddable by strength, divided into 3 ticks, each being 1/3 of the total damage. After the final tick, the enemy is released and afflicted with the knockdown condition. For each tick of damage dealt, Mag recovers 25 shields modeled by strength. Unlike Polarize, these shields actually can flow into overshields, making it significantly better for survivability. Enemies which walk into Crush's radius mid-cast will be picked up and affected for the remainder of the animation, causing them to take whatever ticks of damage are left over. Crush is Mag's main form of survivability, due to the capacity to instantly regenerate your shields in enemy-dense missions. However, it has one significant problem, that being its egregious 1.5 second casting animation. And since this is a full body animation, Mag is rooted to the spot, meaning that enemies outside of its radius can and will gun you down. However, there are 2 main ways to get around this. The first is what I did when I first picked up Mag, which is to use as many cast speed buffs as I can. 5 Tau cast speed shards, natural talent, speed drift, and fracture and crush to grant me a near instant cast and an instant shield gate. The other is to just be more mobile. Similar to other full body abilities, you can cast them while moving in the air, specifically aim gliding. This can let you jump into the air, aim glide, cast crush, and by the time you land again you'll have your full gate back. Speaking of Fracture and Crush, let's talk about that mod, shall we? Fracture and Crush is the best mag augment, hands down. It grants a much needed 50% casting speed for Crush, and strips 75% of enemy armor moddable by strength, and renders enemies unable to move for 7 seconds moddable by duration. Let's tackle each stat one by one, starting with the cast speed. The added cast speed is a requirement on Mag to make her feel good to play, entirely due to Crush, with this power specifically not only making its cast speed good quality of life, also for better survivability. Since Crush's damage and shield gain is done in 3 ticks of damage, the higher your casting speed, the less time between ticks. This is important as if you are damaged between the ticks of Crush, it can prevent you from getting a full shield gate if there aren't enough enemies around Crush for a full gate in a single tick. This also helps as the less time you spend casting Crush, the more time you can spend moving, and enemies in this game have a really hard time hitting a moving object. Second is the armor strip. You need 134 power strength to reach 100% armor strip, and holy does this make her better. See, remember how the tick damage of Magnetize is determined by 25% of the damage you deal? Well, it turns out if you combine Nourish, Polarize shards, and a 100% armor strip, enemies get made into the past tense real fast. While yes, this augment does do less for factions like the Murmur, Infested, and Corpus, several units of this faction still have armor, as do the Acolytes. Few frames have the same capacity for armor stripping than Mag. On top of that, you also get the final part of this augment, which is the rooting effect. Enemies not being able to move isn't as good as it sounds, but it also isn't super detrimental. Enemies can't move around, yes, but they can still attack and use abilities, like Heavy Gunner and Bombard slams, as well as Exergis powers. If anything, this feature is an icing on the cake. Don't get me wrong, it is by no means strong, however, against any melee units, it may as well be a full shutdown. While yes, this means that enemies cannot walk into the suction area of a magnetized bubble, you can use pull to force them into that area anyway. Overall, Crush with its augment is some insane roll compression in Mag's kit, acting as a tertiary crowd control to magnetize and pull, primary survivability and armor stripping primer tool all in one ability. As such, I always recommend builds which have Crush in their kit, which should be all of them, to run this augment. So, that's Mag's kit. But when you go to the arsenal, there's more than one slot there, so let's talk about weapons and companions I like to use with Mag, then dive into my builds for her, and finally some playstyle tips on how best to run her. I talked about it earlier, so it's time we circle back around to the Tenet Arca Plasmor. feels right to cover it first. The Arca is a great hallway hero due to its wide-ass projectile and infinite body punch through, but it really shines when in combination with Magnetized bubbles since, again, here's the build. It's pretty good. I run reload speed on this build, as I find that without it, the reload can be really lethargic, but if you're fine with a slow reload, you can run Vigilante armaments here for more multi-shot. In a similar vein to the Arca, we have its weird sibling shotgun, the Steflos. Despite being Citrin's primary weapon, I find it works a hell of a lot better on mag. The Steflos fires out an arc wave projectile similar to the Arca, however, instead of ricocheting on contact with an enemy, the Steflos projectile gets larger and gains 50% more duration before vanishing. The idea behind this, I think, is to use it in hallways, focusing on tight corridors of enemies and let the waves chew through them with its infinite body punch through. But with Mag's bubbles, you can cause the projectile to be stuck in the blender, hitting enemies over and over until you make your own mini sun. As for modding the Steflos, we're running Merciless for damage, Critical Deceleration and Prime Ravage for crit, as it really does need the crit to help get those first couple kills, Galvanized Hell for multi-shot, Prime Chilling Grasp and Toxic Barrage for viral, Magnetic Strafe for magnetic damage and fire rate, Atomic Fallout for radiation damage and magazine capacity, and then Galvanized Savvy to make the most of the gun's multiplicative CO. Now, this thing kicks like a horse, especially if you're rapid firing, so if you wanted to run Counterbalance in the Exergis slot, I wouldn't blame you. But for what it's worth, you can't beat Galvanized Acceleration, as it increases the range and flight duration of the Steflos, making it much easier to use, both in and out of the mag bubbles. I will say that the Steflos doesn't function as well as a primary weapon when compared to the Arca, and you really do want to be using in the mag bubbles to get the most out of it, but it can still kick out a ridiculous amount of damage, especially if you're able to cluster up a bunch of enemies to help get those projectiles to be really big. Thanks to its multiplicative CO, it works really well in combination with a primer tool as well, be that the Epitaph or Nukor or whatever you want to use. And if you do choose to run it in this way, you can drop Atomic Fallout and Magnetic Strafe for other mods of your choice. I'd recommend Vigilante Armaments or Hunting Munitions, but it's your build at the end of the day. On to our next weapon. Snipers get a bad rap in Warframe, and if I'm honest, it's for good reason. See, there's a phenomena I like to call the wasted damage effect. Now, I'm sure it goes by other names, but basically, if you're only able to hit one enemy at a time for millions of damage, dealing orders of magnitude more damage than their max health, then all the damage you dealt over the enemy's max HP is wasted, compared to an AoE weapon where you can hit upwards of 15 enemies with a single blast, and while that may only be a few hundreds of thousands of damage, it's still enough to kill them, so there is less wasted damage and the AoE weapon has a higher kill efficiency. Meaning that with a high damage single target weapon, you need to hit more shots to get the same number of kills as an AoE weapon. As such, the best weapons in the sniper class tend to have some form of AoE, like the Comarex's explosions, Cydo9's neutralizer having the ability to ricochet, but today we're going to talk about my favourite, the Sporothrix. No, not that Sporothrix, this Sporothrix. The Thrix is an infested sniper you can get in theory from isolation vaults, but in practice you'll just get from the market. Thrix is a weapon with very interesting numbers. It has a 3x crit multi, but a 1% crit chance. A staggering 53% status chance with just barely majority slash weighting. Instead of shooting hit scan projectiles like other snipers, the Thrix shoots a high velocity projectile in the form of a toxic barb. If that barb hits an enemy, it will burrow into them, and after a short 0.9 second delay, explode in a 1.7 meter AoE with a frankly tiny amount of fall off, going from 100% damage at its epicenter to 90% at the outer edge. Instead of keeping the standard IPS damage, it instead only has slash and viral with a slight weighting towards slash. This gives you a hell of a lot of freedom when it comes to modding the Thrix, since you don't need to mod for viral as it's innate on the explosions. This allows you to mod for viral and corrosive, and we all know how good of a combination that can be. Now, many people see that juicy 3x crit multi and try and make the Thrix work with external crit modifiers like Arrow, Citrine, Mesa, and Arcane Avenger. That isn't how you get the most power out of the Thrix, especially not with mag. That would be to cram as many AoE statuses as possible using the Thrix's unique augment, Volatile Variant. And oh boy is this weapon augment worth running. In my opinion, it's the best weapon augment in the game, next to Sentient Surge and Unseen Dread. Volatile Variant gives the Thrix 3 meters of punch through and locks it at that value, so modding for more punch through does nothing. It also massively increases the size of the barbed explosions to 5.7 meters. and gives the explosions an extra 50% status chance as it is with other status chance mods. It also removes the 0.9 second arming time and causes the barbs to explode immediately on impact. Now, the instant explosions, massive AoE and increased status chance are all really good, but the punch through is the real star here. See, it causes the Thrix's explosions to occur every time it hits an enemy. So if we had a tool to, I don't know, group enemies together in one nice little clump, which just so happens to let projectiles fly around and hit a bunch of enemies at the same time, then we can trigger a bunch of explosions all instantly that causes the projectile to keep orbiting and leads to like fun chain reaction. Oh hey, what are you doing here, Magnetize? This can lead to some abject silliness, and the damage this thing can kick out is insane. I like running electric and gas for more AoE damage over time effects in combination with the already high slash weighting, as well as using the new magnetic mod to help with overguard, and radiation for another status proc. Now, is this overboard for a weapon with additive condition overload? Yes. However, shut up. Ideally, you'd not want to run all these elements and just get a ribbon with something like multi-shot, status chance, damage and fire rate, and a minus zoom, and just stick with gas, electric, slash, and viral for your elements. But that requires more of a Kuva addiction than I have, and I don't have time for that. The Thrix has become my go-to primary weapon on Mag since Volatile variant release due to how strong it is, both with Mag and on its own. While sure, hip firing is about as accurate as me playing darts, if you can point in the general direction of a group of mods and at least a few of them hit, all of them are going to get covered in DOT status effects. And thanks to its huge AoE, oh yeah, did I forget to mention, the AoE doesn't need line of sight and can pass through map geometry. It can deal a lot of damage. If you can, I highly recommend trying out the Thrix with Mag, you won't regret it. On a similar vein of cloud-based infested weaponry, we have the Mutalist Cernos, for very similar reasons as the Sporothrix, in that the Mutalist Cernos is a weapon with AoE damaging clouds. Now, Mute Cernos is based toxin, not viral unfortunately, but it makes up for it with access to the mod Split Flights, which allows the Mute Cernos to get some really high multi-shot values. And thanks to Magnetize, we don't need to worry about the minus accuracy penalty that comes with each stack of Split Flights. Now, you may be worried about the very short 2-second duration of Split Flights, since after all, bows don't have the highest number when it comes to rounds per minute, but for some reason the damage from the clouds satisfy the condition for a hit, meaning that all you need to do is aim for a bubble and forget about constantly having to upkeep your buff. Mutalist Cernos is also similar to the Sporothrix in its numbers. It has a very low critical chance, the second lowest of all bows, only next to its older brother the Probasco Cernos, and a relatively low crit multi, but makes up for it with its eye-watering 49% status chance. Now, what sets the Mutalist Cernos apart from the Sporothrix, aside from being a bow and having access to split flights, is its criminal 4,100 additive gun CO on its charged shot clouds, as well as its multiplicative CO on its uncharged shots. Because of the cloud's really high tick damage and also its really good status chance, using a build that mods full element for damage is really strong here. I'm currently running Blast Electric and I'm loving it. The best way I've found to use it is to fire a charged shot into a bubble first, use that to stack up split flights and prime enemies with status, and follow up with a quick shot to kill them really quickly with the multiplicative CO charge clouds. For the build then, I am running Electric and Blast, as we mentioned earlier, but also Corrosive, as that can help reduce armor even further, and also gives us another status effect for our multiplicative gun CO. We're also running Rifle Elementalist to increase the damage of our DOTs, Split Flights for multi-shot, Galvanized Aptitude for our wacky gun CO numbers. For my Riven, you're going to want to replace it with High Voltage, and finally Vile Acceleration for fire rate. Now where I have Vigilante armaments, this is really more of a flex slot. The technical best option is to run a primed Bane, but I don't like having to swap my build around for each mission. But if you roll a Riven with high crit chance, you can get away with using Hammershot here, but since I don't, I run Vigilante armaments. As for the Arcane, I've seen some contention as to which is better, but for what it's worth, just use Primary Merciless for damage. I've seen Longbow Sharpshot used, but the headshots aren't consistent enough, and the damage buff is lower than Merciless anyways. Speaking of bows, in the most recent Nightwave, everyone's favourite emo boy's weapons got some new augments. But the one I'm here to talk about is Unseen Dread. When you hit 3 or more enemies with a single arrow from Dread, it grants you invisibility for 5 seconds, and while invisible, a nice 1.75% increased critical damage, which can be refreshed by hitting another 3 enemies with a single arrow. Now, I know that the bubble's tick damage and explosion don't scale with crit, however, this thing does numbers. Thanks to the Dread's already high crit stats, the added 1.75 critical damage is a really big boost. Also, this buff isn't tied to the invisibility granted from the augment, but instead any invisibility, so by running Shade as your companion or subsuming on Ibarra's quiver. Unfortunately, you cannot cheese its 3-hit requirement with things like Blast, Multi-Shot, or Thunderbolt. However, the Dread does innately have 1 meter of punch through, meaning you can trigger this property if you line up your shots right, and you don't even need to mod for it. But where this gets really interesting is with its Incarnon form. Using Hitman's opportunity for more damage, swift deliverance for projectile speed, and zeroed in for higher crit multi, you can pump its damage even higher. While in its Incarnon form, it swaps these tiny arrows for giant plasma waves with built-in heat damage for some really nice numbers. I don't think I need to explain the synergy here with Mag's bubbles grouping up enemies and allowing single projectiles to hit mobs multiple times, and Unseen Dread's condition. But the best part is the Incarnon form's hidden stat of infinite body punch through, meaning these heat arrows last for ages, turning your bubbles into blenders. And as if that wasn't enough, this thing also has multiplicative CO. Onto the build then, Galvanized Chamber for multi-shot, Unseen Dread, critical delay and vital sense for crit stats, Galvanized Aptitude for multiplicative gun CO, Maligant Force and Rhyme Rounds for viral, File Acceleration for fire rate, trust me you need it, Vigilante Supplies in the Exergis for more crit, and finally Primary Merciless. There are a few options you can toy around with, but I'm going to talk you through why I choose not to use them. The first one is easier, dropping Primary Merciless for the new Spectral Serration mod. Spectral Serration, simply put, does not have the same uptime as Primary Merciless, only lasting while you're invisible, which at base is only 5 seconds. And it even grants a lower value than Merciless does at max stacks. But also, you need to slot Spectral Serration into the build, which means you have to drop another mod, which is tough since we want to use all these slots for other stats. So yes, it frees up your Arcane slot, but the question is, what do you put in it instead? You can't run Frostbite or Blight since they would combine with the innate heat in the Incarnon form. Plated Round give you a minuscule buff since you have a magazine of 1. Brux requires weak points hits, which we can't get consistently thanks to bubbles. Exhilarate requires Impact Pros, which we ain't getting with the weighting. The only arcane worth considering it is Obstruct, but again, that requires you to run yet another mod in the form of Magnetic Capacity, which we're already tight on space in this build. For what it's worth, stick with Merciless. Spectral Serration is fun, it's neat, but it's not worth it. The other option is much more of a toss-up between Split Flights and Galvanized Chamber, which honestly, dealer's choice here. I've used both and like both, but prefer Galvanized Chambers consistently. The spam you can kick out with the Dread makes Split Flights viable, as long as you shoot once every 4 seconds. It's a trade-off whether you want the consistency of Gal Chamber or the higher multi-shot peaks of Split Flights. Another fun tool added in 1999 is Arcane Crepuscular, which not only grants 30% ability strength while invisible, it also grants an extra 3x crit multiplier while invisible, which, surprise, more crit multi good. Moving on to yet another shotgun and one of my favourites of all time, the Exergis. The reason I love the Exergis on Mag is the same reason. Infinite body punch through synergizes amazingly well with the Mag bubbles, turning them into blenders thanks to its high slash weighting. You can also choose to run Blast or Corrosive for more raw damage, but I prefer to run Viral. The Exergis can also run Ammo Stock to double its magazine capacity from 2 to 3. No need to run Primed Ammo Stock on its own since it doesn't increase the magazine capacity to 3. Exergis already has a really low crit chance and crit multi, so you can mod for other stats without limiting your damage, since again, the bubbles take an explosion don't care for crit. I'm running Gal Hell for multi-shot, 2 elements of your choice to make either Viral, Corrosive or Blast, Ammo Stock and Prime Tactical Pump to double the magazine capacity and increase their reload speed. If you wanted to swap these out for 2 crit mods, you could, but again, I don't recommend it. Galvanized Savvy for gun CO, as it is yet another weapon with multiplicative CO. Galvanized Acceleration in the Exilus slot to reduce its fall off and increase its range. Primary Merciless in the Arcane slot, and for this Riven you can replace it with Vigilante Armaments. Now, an ideal Riven would have 60% magazine capacity, so you don't have to run Ammo Stock. However, you could run Atomic Fallout and Primed Ammo Stock to bring your magazine capacity for 3 at the cost of a minor fire rate decrease and losing magnetic damage for radiation. Alternatively, you can run Semi-Shotgun Cannonade over the Riven and Shotgun Vendetta in the Arcane slot for more multi-shot. This is nice because Shotgun Vendetta increases your reload speed, but you are forced to use Atomic Fallout over Magnetic Strafe, since Magnetic Strafe's increased fire rate is counteracted by semi-shotgun cannonade, locking you at the base fire rate. However, this does also mean you can run Atomic Fallout and primed ammo stock to bring your magazine capacity up to 3. I cannot understate how fun the Exergis is. Severely underrated gun in my opinion, and super fun with mag. If you're able to get yourself a rhythm with magazine capacity, go for it. And that's it. That's all the primary weapons with a good synergy with mag that I want to talk about in this video. There's nothing else. There's no other primary weapons in... Fuck, fine, we'll talk about the Penta. I knew I'd have to talk about this eventually. My least favourite, yet most popular synergy with mag, the Sakura Penta. Truth is that any weapon in the Penta family works, but Sakura has the best stats, so it sees the most use. This weapon is the namesake for Zen's Infinity Mag build, but I just can't get behind it, man. With the exception of the Mutalist Cernos, all of the weapons I like to run on mag have the capacity to function outside of the context of the mag bubble, but this thing... This ain't it, Chief. The Sakura Penta is a grenade launcher, which fires out these grenade projectiles with a heavy arc. You can only have a max of 5 grenades out at any given time, and pressing Alt-Fire causes them to detonate, resulting in an explosion in a 6-meter radius. The grenades themselves deal a small amount of impact damage with moderate crit stats and status stats, but that's about it, save for the faction effect sequence. Each time you get 1000 affinity with the Sakura Penta, each time you gain 1000 affinity with the Sakura Penta, it causes an explosion in a 25-meter radius where all enemies take 1000 radiation damage and a force radiation proc. You instantly recover 25% of your max shields and gain 50% of your shields back every second for 30 seconds. It's a nice effect, the force radiation proc and shield generation are good, but you can add radiation with a single mod now and half a kit recovers shields anyway. In the past, Sakura Penta relied on its decent crit chance of 26% to proc hunter munitions and do slash, and yes, it can do a lot of damage thanks to, but with the advent of new Blast, it's much better to run a Blast electric focused setup to deal more damage with its explosions. The main gripe I have with it is that as soon as the bubble expires or detonates, the grenades you fire are flung in a random direction, and you have to manually detonate them by pressing Alt-Fire in order to shoot new ones into the next bubbles. This results in a high level of micromanaging each bubble, since as soon as the first expires you need to detonate your grenades and shoot active bubbles, and the weapon had a feature similar to Mag's bubbles where if you shoot a new grenade, the oldest ones would detonate, instead of preventing you from firing altogether. I think it will be a better weapon. Aside from the gun's synergy with Magnetized's bubbles, it doesn't really have anything going for it. Even its augment doesn't help, since tether grenades just prevents the target from leaving the grenade's blast radius, which, you know what else does? Magnetize bubbles. Is it strong? Yes. Can it shred acolytes? Yes. Do I like it? No. Would I recommend it? I guess? If you really want to see a silly blender, then just go for it, but don't expect much outside of Magnetize. Here's the build I'm using. Pretty standard stuff. Is it optimized? Probably not. Do I care? No. Any other weapon on this list I would prefer to run over the Sakura Penta, but it's a mag video, I have to talk about it legally. On a brighter note, let's look at secondary options, starting with the Kuva Nukor. Similar to the Thrix, in that this thing is a status machine with high crit multi and a low crit chance. The Nukor lacks the similar AoE of the Thrix, instead having chaining beams and a 60% progenitor bonus. If you want a status tool, you can go for an impact progenitor with hemorrhage for 2 elements you can't get on the Nukor otherwise. However, if you want a good damage build, then mod for Blast. Thanks to the Nukor's high status chance and fire rate, you can very easily hit the 10 stacks of Blast required to cause the larger explosions. When the Nukor's main beam hits an enemy, its beam will split off and chain to up to 2 other enemies within a 9-meter radius, dealing 50% of the main beam's damage. This can go even further by modding for Punch Through, as for some reason, this causes the main beam to chain each enemy hit by it. So if you hit 3 enemies with the main beam, it will create 6 new chains. So, modding for Punch Through and using grouping tools such as Magnetize and Pull allows you to cluster a bunch of enemies together, cause those chain beams to all hit each other and constantly trigger the Blast status effect for massive damage. Now, this setup, no surprise, excels with Pistol Elementalist to further increase the damage of Blast explosions. With this build you can once again drop crit for a more status focused setup. I've got a magnetic progenitor to help combat overguard and cause electric explosions, but if you want, you can run a heat or cold progenitor for a higher blast value and the new magnetic might mod, so you can still proc magnetic to help you with overguard. Nukor has always and will continue to be a good secondary weapon with very high usage rates for a reason. Here's the build. I'm rocking Hornet Strike for damage since our arcane slot is taken by secondary Encumber, Galvanized Diffusion and Lethal Torrent for more multi-shot, Pistol Elementalist for more status damage, Seeker for punch through, Scorch and Frostbite for blast, Galvanized Shot for gun CO, and finally Ruinous Extension in the Exilus slot. In a similar vein we have the Atomos Incarnate, yet another chain beam weapon with a focus on heat damage allowing us to turn that into blast. Similar to the Nukor, by modding for punch through you can get additional chain beams. However, instead of 2 chains emitting from the initial target as is the case with the Nukor, the Atomos will fire 1 chain to an enemy within 7 meters, at which point this secondary enemy will fire a new chain to another enemy within 7 meters. The beam can chain a max of 3 times and deals 0.75 to the power of n% of the damage, where n is the number of times that beam has chained. The Incarnon form is good. It turns it from a chaining beam weapon into a pocket grenade launcher with a focus on high blast damage, but it lacks the same synergy with the primary fire and mag bubble, so I tend to just stick to using it in its base form. For the evolutions we are running Hoplite Virtue, Moonrise Velocity and Elemental Balance. If you wanted to run a crit setup you can, swap to Paladin Virtue and Commodore's Fortune for that. For the build then, Galvanized Diffusion and Lethal Torrent for multi-shot and some fire rate, Galvanized Shot for gun CO, Hornet Strike for base damage, Scorch and Frost to make blast, Pistol Elementalist for status damage, Seeker for punch through, secondary Encumber for more status applications, since with its high status chance we're constantly proccing blast and we'll get a lot of different statuses for Galvanized Shot. I find the Atomos is a good side grade to the Nukor, both blast damaging and chaining beam weapons with good synergy with max bubbles. As for which is better, it's honestly a toss-up and I would go with whichever you have the most investment for. Kuva Nukor is probably easier to build since it has the added capacity as part of a Kuva weapon, but you do need to get to 60% progenitor bonus to get the most out of the gun. Another secondary I fell in love with when using Mag has been the Lex Incarnon. In its base form the Lex is a slow-firing, hard-hitting pistol, and in its Incarnon it doubles down, letting you shoot out massive plasma waves similar to the Arca Plasmor that can do some very big numbers. Now, unfortunately this thing is slow, like really slow, less than 1 bullet per second slow. Thankfully, we can run gas damage to help get around that. We're running gas over blast here as we're not firing or proccing status fast enough to get to the 10 stack of blast to get the bigger explosion, so gas it is. For the build we are running Galvanized Diffusion and Lethal Torrent for multi-shot and a bit of fire rate, Primed Heated Charge and Pistol Pestilence for gas damage, Creeping Bullseye and Primed Target Cracker for crit stats, Galvanized Shot for gun CO, Secondary Merciless for damage, and Hemorrhage. This is because the Lex's Incarnon form forces a guaranteed impact proc. This means that a lot of the time you're also going to be proccing Slash, which not only with this thing's really high damage is going to be a significant amount of bleed damage, but it's also another status effect for our gun CO to work with. For evolutions, yet again we are running Hoplite Virtue for more damage, Lex Talionesis for more accuracy and less recoil. If I'm honest, none of these options are that great. This is just the best one since it helps you get into your Incarnon form a little bit quicker, but I have also seen success with Extended Volley. And finally we are using Critical Parallel for more crit chance and a higher crit multi. Lex is a really good single target nuke of a pistol, a hallway hero which allows it to thrive very well in max bubbles thanks to similar reasons as the Arca and the Steflos. It works very well as a big one-shot gun to get rid of heavy units thanks to its minimal amount of build-up and really high damage output. On to yet another solid beam weapon, the Ocucor. Thanks to its Augment Sentient Surge, this thing has a bottomless mag, high crit and status, and fires out 4 auto-targeting energy tendrils, dealing damage in unison with the main beam. Ocucor has always been strong, but after the release of Sentient Surge, it became very strong indeed. With each kill, the Ocucor not only gains another tendril as usual, but also refills its magazine capacity by 20% and grants an additional 60% crit and status chance for each active tendril, capping out at a max of 240%. This allows the Ocucor to clear through missions since the tendrils are auto-targeting, you don't even need to aim. For this build we are running Galvanized Diffusion and Lethal Torrent for multi-shot, Frostbite, Pistol Pestilence and Primed Heated Charge for elements, Galvanized Shot for gun CO, Sentient Surge of course, and instead of a Riven I would recommend running Primed Target Cracker since you already get crit chance from Sentient Surge. For the Exilus slot, we are running Ruinous Extension for more range, and our Arcane slot is taken by Cascadia Flare. This is because we can proc as much heat with this thing as we need to get the activation condition, and the buff is higher than Merciless, and we don't care about the 30% passive reload speed buff from Merciless, since Sentient Surge reloads our magazine for us. You can run a version of this build that uses blast damage and secondary Merciless. This once again makes use of Pistol Elementalist to further amp up the damage of the blast explosions, and it's really strong, especially in the context of max bubbles. Finally, on to melee. I have a few options depending on the style of play. We have 2 standard light attack setups and 3 heavy attack setups. For the first standard light attack build, we have the dual Ichor Incarnon, my favourite dual swords due to the toxic clouds and increased stats of the Incarnon weapon. I adore the Ichor. By modding for viral and electric and melee influence, it functions as both a primer for spreading viral and a damage tool for its, well, damage. For the evolution, we're using Ronin's Rush for attack speed, letting us save a mod slot on the build, Orican Reach for more range, and Absolute Valor for more status chance. For the build then, we are running Viral thanks to Virulent Scourge and Vicious Frost, as well as Electric from Shocking Touch, Condition Overload for its damage effect, Primed Reach for more range, and Weeping Wounds and Blood Rush for crit and status as we build up our combo. For the Exilus slot, I'm running Discipline's Merit as it gives you Tennokai consistently. For the Riven, I recommend you replace it with a crit damage mod, such as Organ Shatter, or you could even use Galvanized Steel from higher crit chance. Now, the reason why we modded for Electric is to make use of melee influence. Because of the Ichor's really high status chance, a lot of the time we're going to be proccing Electric. That means that we can apply all of our elemental status effects on everything in a 20-meter radius, priming them with Viral and Electric, as well as Toxin from the Ichor Incarnon's Toxic Clouds. Alternatively, you could run melee Duplicate with a Corrosive build for more single target damage. Just be wary of going over 100% critical chance with this build, as if you do, melee Duplicate starts to lose its effect. Hence why we've modded for Galvanized Steel here over Blood Rush. Our other light attack weapon is the Okina Prime Incarnon. The Okina's Incarnon form causes kills to generate spectral ice daggers which fly out towards enemies and inflict max cold status effect. While this is nice, it isn't the strongest, but by modding for Blast we can make these daggers cause chain explosions, letting us use Influence and Electric to create homing projectile daggers which spread the blast status over a massive radius. For evolutions, I'm using Synergis Surety, Orican Reach for range, and Survivor's Edge for more stats. For the build, we are using Condition Overload, Vicious Frost, Volcanic Edge, Weeping Wounds, Shocking Touch, and Galvanized Elementalist for our status, Blood Rush and Galvanized Steel for crit, and again Discipline and Merit for consistent Tennokai. Despite the cold damage on the daggers being made into Blast, unfortunately each dagger doesn't cause 10 stacks of Blast. The max cold stack to baked into the weapon itself. This thing already has a nut status chance, so hitting 10 stacks isn't too difficult, especially when mobs are grouped in Magnetized bubbles and under the effect of influence. For both of these weapons, I highly recommend you use the Naraman Focus School, as that really allows you to keep your combo count up, allowing you to get the most out of Blood Rush and Weeping Wounds. On to our first of the heavy attack weapons, and this should be no surprise for anyone who's been paying attention to Warframe's melee meta for the past couple of years. It's the Glaives. Specifically the Zorus, Pathesis, and Glaive Prime. Zorus you want to mod for Blast and use the Force Electric proc from the explosions with melee influence for a huge AoE. Pathesis you're going to want to mod for Electric and use the innate Viral to spread to all enemies in a huge radius. And Glaive, you just be Glaive. Are these the most optimized builds? No, probably not, but god do these weapons not need it. Glaives have been super strong for a long time now thanks to how good a metric fuck ton of damage in a big AoE is. As for synergies with Mag, they all appreciate the armor strip of Crush, but then again so does all weapons, and Magnetize for grouping. There's no real special synergy like other weapons, these things are just boomerangs that violate the Geneva Conventions, so they're pretty good regardless. Next up we have my most used melee weapon, the Stropha. This thing was my go-to for so long thanks to not having to worry about building up combo. Just run up, point, and blast. The Stropha will always hold a special place in my heart. For the build, we're running a standard initial combo setup with the new Galvanized mods, and melee influence to help spread that damage out over a larger area. Stropha is very similar to the Arca, Steflos, and Lex in its functionality. Heavy attacks launch out wave projectiles with high impact damage. Using the grouping and projectile trapping of the bubbles synergizes perfectly. Thanks to the long duration of Galvanized Reflex, you can easily keep your Stropha as a backup weapon, good for taking out single high health units with multi-millions of damage. Our final heavy attack weapon was actually teased right at the start. The Arca Triton. Yes, 2 out of the 3 Arca weapons are here on this list. Sorry Cisco, maybe one day you'll get a Tenet version, but until then, you'll just be resorted to MR fodder. With its passive slam capacitor increasing your next slam's damage by 250%, and its range by 2 meters for each kill up to 5 times, as well as force proccing electric, yeah, this thing is pretty damn good. By using melee influence on top of that, you can take your insane AoE damage and turn it into a massive area of electric procs, which, with the right ribbon, this thing is downright criminal. The build I'm running is this: Prime Pressure Point for damage, Sack Steel and Organ Shatter for crit stats, Seismic Wave for slam damage, Galvanized Reflex for initial combo, Shocking Touch for even more electric, and my Riven, which is giving me even more crit chance and crit damage, but you could replace this with Gladiator Might. Thanks to Mag's bubbles grouping up enemies, you can easily use the Titrons to slam your way through crowds. There's a damn good reason the Asia server had been using this thing for so long, and here's a little tip: you can actually cancel the end of the slam animation with a roll, letting you be even more dangerous and mobile. Admittedly, not that there'll be much left in a 20 meter radius after you use this thing. Thank God. 29 pages deep, and we've finally finished talking about weapons. Let's move on to the frame herself and talk about each build and why I use them and what they each excel at. First off, this is my general Nourish caster setup. This is the one you've seen in most of the background footage of this video. The build uses Nourish over her first ability to provide us with viral damage, as well as a good source of energy regeneration thanks to Energy Nexus. As Nourish is a viral weapon damage buff and Polarize shards are coded as weapons, we can use that blender setup I showed off earlier. This build wants a higher strength for more Nourish buffs and to give us 100% armor straight with Fracturize and Crush, as well as full shields from Polarize. Arcane choice is Aegis for the 12 seconds of immortality due to the constant shield regeneration, and Augmented. Truth is, Augmented is a flex slot here. You can run whatever arcanes you want to buff your weapon with, but in my opinion, the best thing to use here is Arachne. Again, remember, Polarized shards are coded as weapons, and Arachne is just a generic weapon damage buff. So, cling to a wall and it gives your Polarized shards an extra 150% weapon damage. By running this build, you also unlock the second secret mode to all the other weapon builds I just showed. It's corrosive, it's just corrosive. See, Nourish provides you with viral damage, meaning you can mod for corrosive, cast Nourish, and get the benefits of both. Admittedly, this doesn't work with melee, since you can't mod for corrosive and keep the electric needed for melee influence, which is a shame, but it's not like much of them need the buff anyway. This is a strong, comfy build which focuses on bubbles and weapon synergies to keep Mag upright and killing, and in my opinion, it's super fun. It's my go-to Mag build when I just want to turn my brain off and grind out some missions. The alternative to this build is very weapon specific. See, using the new Arcane Crepuscular for more crit, multi, and power strength while invisible, using the Dread Incarnon and Unseen Dread, you can increase the funny numbers even more. Another variation you can make is with the Atomos Incarnon. See, if you want to run it as a crit version, you need to have your energy max over 700 to get the additional critical damage multiplier. So to do this on the build, we run Prime Flow over Energy Nexus, since you don't really need both for your energy economy, only one is enough. An old classic build for me is the Breach Surge build. This is the first build I really put together when I was working on Mag, and my god, you can hit some silly multi-million damage numbers thanks to the scaling of Surge Sparks. Using Magnetize to group up enemies, Breach Surge to prime them, and then finally Crush to trigger them all at once in Armor Strip will cause anything in the bubble to evaporate. And when the bubble finally does expire or you use Magnetized Discharge, it creates a large pop of multi-million magnetic damage thanks to all the damage stored in the bubble from these sparks, and has been one I've used for the longest amount of time and can confirm it's been put through its paces. We're using Flow and Arcane Energize here for our energy sustain, as without Nourish, Energy Nexus isn't nearly enough energy to keep up with the amount we're casting. The final build I want to go through here is a base kit build. No helmet, no nothing. This is almost identical to the first build, just without a helmet slot, and using Primed Flow and Arcane Energize for energy sustain. Mag doesn't really have a free subsume slot. You could argue it's Polarize or Pull, but both of them work really nice in the context of her kit. And so for this build, it has no subsume slots. It runs entirely the base kit and what comes with her, and I find it really fun just to mess around with her base kit. As for all Mag builds, I run the same shards: 1 Tau Strength, 3 Tau Cast Speed, and 1 Violet Equilibrium. This helps increase the damage of her powers and helmet, make Crush not take an age to cast, and helps with our energy economy a bit more. Now, if you have eyes and have been watching this video, no doubt you've seen something like this in the background. So let's talk about that. This is my Hound. There are many others like it, but this one is mine. Hounds are modular robotic companions from the Sisters of Parvos, but that whole modular part doesn't really matter all that much if I'm honest. See, these components determine three things about the Hound: the weapons, which are interchangeable, its precept mods, which are also interchangeable, and its health stats. But to be honest, these changes are minimal. The core will increase health, armor, and shields by 100, and the bracket will further modify these values by plus 10, plus 15, and minus 5 depending on the bracket. All that to say, run whichever looks nicest. I'm using Adelt, Zub, and Hinta, as this was one I got from a sister and couldn't be bothered to make my own. That said, Hounds are really strong companions thanks to their precepts, namely, Synergized Prospectus. This fires out a bouncing spark which can bounce up to 7 times and causes an explosion in a 10-meter radius, dealing electric damage with a guaranteed status proc. This power is on a 10-second cooldown, which is really short for precepts. Now, this doesn't sound too strong until you throw on Manifold Bond, which lets Synergized Prospectus feel the same status as our Hound weapon, in this case, the Batotan. By modding for viral, magnetic, and heat, we will proc each of these, as well as electric, impact, and puncture with every hit of Synergized Prospectus. Thanks to Galvanized Elementalist and Condition Overload, these numbers are big. Lasting Sting helps increase the status duration, but you could drop it for Focus Radon to add radiation procs to the mix. Our last mod here is Shattering Impact. This is just to allow the Hound's melee attacks to also armor strip. If you wanted to, again, you could also just replace this with Focus Radon for even more statuses. You can also run Corrosive, Cold, and Magnetic if you're running a version of Mag with Nourish, as Viral's weapon buff also applies to your Hound. Or you could run Corrosive and Heat for an entirely anti-armor setup. This is because the combination of Manifold, Contagious, and Vicious Bond lets you spread those corrosive procs over a massive area, making this Hound incredible at removing armor on a large scale, which is why I choose to use it since it's such a god tier supportive option. There's also the damage element of Contagious Bond, since if you run a weapon that uses heat, those incredibly large heat values are going to be spread to other nearby enemies in a 9-meter radius, meaning that if an enemy is hit by Synergized Prospectus and they're right on the outer edge, they can then spread their status effects within a 9-meter radius, essentially giving each explosion a maximum range of 19 meters. The other mods on the Hound itself are also really important. Of course, we are running Synergized Prospectus, as that is the main draw of running a Hound. We're also running Calculated Redirection to increase our maximum shields. Hounds do have a shield gate, so by running this you increase its duration from 1.7 seconds to 2.5 seconds. Remember, you can also regenerate your Hound shields by casting Polarize, since they count as an ally. The aforementioned Manifold, Contagious, and Vicious Bond, all here to help increase the effectiveness of Synergized Prospectus and allow it to spread even more procs around a wider area. Reinforced Bond is on here to add some more fire rate, since we are well above the 1200 shield cap. And Momentous Bond is on here for an interesting reason. See, by killing an Exergis, it grants the Hound's weapon a 120% elemental bonus. And because the Hound's weapon gets this bonus, it counts for Manifold Bond, allowing it to start spreading that same type of element with Synergized Prospectus. It also helps shorten the amount of downtime your Hound has, since Exergis enemies are pretty common in Steel Path. If your Hound does go down, you can just kill a couple of them and get it back in fighting order. Now, it's important to put Guardian after Synergized Prospectus, since we wanted to always activate Synergized Prospectus first and Guardian second. This mod allows Mag to stay alive a little bit better, since it will constantly replenish Mag shields whenever they break. We are of course running Vacuum, as it allows us to collect loot from further away. Now, again, like we talked about earlier, you could replace this with any other mod of your choice, but for me, I really value the increased range of Vacuum, so it's on this build. And the last slot is Primed Animal Instinct for Loot Radar and Enemy Radar. Now, this is a flex slot. In truth, you can get away with running a different mod of your choice. For what it's worth, I would highly recommend either Medipet Kit to help decrease your companion's recovery time, or Synth Deconstruct, since enemies injured or killed by Synergized Prospectus will have an increased chance to drop a health orb, which thanks to the Violet Shard, results in even more energy generation for Mag. Hounds are amazing companions on any Warframe, but especially Mag, since, while inconsistent, the Prospectus sparks can get caught in Magnetize bubbles and can lead to really high damage nukes left dotted around the field, but they aren't the only companion that Mag works well with. Diriga can play a similar role of Status Prime, though lacks the damage of the Hounds. Worm can be used for more survivability since it's able to cleanse status. And Panzer is always a solid option due to its viral spreading. This is nice as it lets you run corrosive on your weapons while using Breach Surge or a Helminthus build and still be able to proc viral on enemies. The final thing I want to talk about is the Focus School, as there is one which is far and away the best on Mag, that being Madurai. Not only does it add an extra 30% physical damage, but thanks to the power of Void Strike's insane 1000% damage buff, if you do go down with Mag, you can pop Void Strike and shoot into a bubble to instantly pop back up, using, as mentioned before, the X47 amp. Since the Glaive Alt-Fire for some reason has, if you go down with an active Mad Bubble, you can shoot 1 or 2 Glaives in there and get your insta-res. For Arcanes I'm using Magus Cloud and Lockdown, mostly for Endless Void Cascade, and as for the Amp Arcanes, I'm running Eternal Eradicate and Eternal Onslaught. Since Void Strike is an ability cast that drains all your energy, both of these proc immediately. Mag is a very strong Warframe, and in my opinion, severely underrated. While she definitely doesn't excel in certain content, like captures where other Warframes are better at killing, she definitely excels in high duration endless missions like Void Cascade, high enemy levels thanks to the ridiculous amount of damage she can deal with her weapons, such as Deep Archimedia, as well as most other relevant content in Warframe at the moment. When using Mag, there is a good rotation you should use for your abilities. If you're using the base kit, I would recommend using Magnetize to group enemies up, Polarize to do a little bit of armor stripping but mainly generate Polarize shards, and then finally Crush to get the rest of your full strip on. Use Pol to group enemies into this Magnetized blender, or use Magnetized Discharge to pop bubbles when they get full of enough damage to nuke a room. If you're running the Nourish setup, it plays basically the same, except for you want to always have Nourish active for the added energy regeneration and viral damage. If you're using the Breach Surge setup, I recommend playing much the same, but instead of casting Polarize, you're casting Breach Surge. It's a good ability to spam out as it can bind enemies and help really improve your survivability while also increasing your damage. Now, there are a few weapons and synergies that I haven't talked about yet. Maybe if this video does really well, say like, 20 likes, yeah, that's doable, 20 likes, I'll release that secret source in a second part 2 of this video. That all being said, that's it. We're done. 33 pages into this script. You now know all you need to know about Mag, her builds, her synergies, and how best to play her. And I just want to say thank you for watching. This video has been a long time coming and a marathon to make, and I hope you enjoyed and learned something new about Mag. She is my favourite Warframe, and the fact that I just get to info dump about her for this long and you sat here and watched it all is amazing. She truly is my favourite Warframe and the one I've spent the most time build crafting and theory making with, and I hope that this video has given you plenty of ideas on various weapons that you could try out to synergize well with her bubbles. But, with that said, thank you all so much for watching to the end, I really do appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one.